Many people may not realize that on-field dizziness is 6 times more predictive of bad outcome than any other symptom of concussion. If you report the sensation of dizziness, you're 6 times more likely to take longer to recover from concussion. 6 times more likely than losing consciousness. So the symptoms you want to look for with this injury: slow, wavy, dizzy, foggy, feeling one step behind, detached, removed, obviously headache, nausea, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, feeling tired, emotional changes, feeling fatigued. Those are hard symptoms to get someone to admit to. You know, it's not an easy thing. If you see an athlete who clutches their head after being hit, or has balance problems standing up, or is adjusting their eyes a lot, these are all no-go signs. You don't put those athletes back to play. It's very simple. And your comment, when in doubt, sit them out, does apply in these situations, because this is an injury that's subtle and can evolve. There's up to 3.8 million concussions in sports and recreation alone in this country per year. That's pretty striking. About 1 in 10 contact sport athletes will have a concussion per season. When you look at sports, what's one of the more fascinating things is if you look at sports where between genders where the rules are the same, for example, basketball, hockey, soccer, the incidence of concussion is higher in females than it is in male. One of the biggest risk factors for concussion is a history of car sickness, believe it or not, and girls are more likely to be car sick than boys. Another major risk factor for concussion is migraine. Girls are 6 times more likely to have migraine than boys. Neck strength could play a role in that. Hormonal influences may play a role. We've published some research on that. But clearly, when you look at the same sport and the same rules between males, females, we see a higher. Put it this way: we have about 20,000 cases come through our clinic a year here. About 60% are female and 40% are male. Up to 90% of equestrian athletes will have a concussion in their lifetime.
Oh my goodness!
9 out of 10. And the reason why is because that's a big beast they fall off of, you know, and there's a lot of forces involved with that. But yeah, equestrian sports is number 1. Football is up there, obviously. You know, women's soccer is up there. Hockey is up there. You know, force equals mass times acceleration. And, you know, the heavier something is, the faster it's moving, the more forces that are impacted, and that can result in the brain moving inside the skull. There's no biomarker right now that I would use in my clinic to diagnose this concussion, because there's more research that's needed. There's a lot of smart people looking at that, but at this point in time, they're not ready for prime time. Could that change? Possibly, but possibly not as well. We've been looking for a biomarker for Alzheimer's disease for 4 decades and haven't found it. So the brain's a complicated thing. And even if there is a biomarker, it's not going to be as simple as black and white with this. It's a very complex organ.
What are some other factors that increase or decrease the risk of a concussion?
I'd say the number 1 factor in terms of our research and my clinical experience is anxiety. Patients that have a hot sympathetic nervous system or have a lot of anxiety, we find that there's less force that causes concussion and the outcomes are more significant. There's a lot of biology between certain systems that are affected by concussion in the nervous system. And so we see some synergies there. But the biggest risk factors for this injury: anxiety, history of car sickness, history of migraine, history of lazy eye or strabismus is a big risk factor. Being female, those would be the biggest ones. And believe it or not, those are all more predictive than prior history of concussion in predicting bad outcomes. I always say this: concussion fights dirty. Whatever you bring to the table that's weak or a problem will get outed after an injury. If you have a history of lazy eye, you're more likely to have ocular problems. You have a history of learning disability, you're more likely to have cognitive problems. If you have a history of car sickness, you're more likely to have vestibular problems. If you have a history of migraine, you're more likely to have migraine. And if you have a history of anxiety, you're more likely to be anxious. And we've published papers on all those topics. And there's a very strong synergy, biologically speaking, about some of these very precious systems in the brain and autonomic arousal or anxiety. There's very good behavioral treatments for these problems. And the way you treat a vestibular problem, by the way, how do you know how to treat that?
I do not.
Exposure.
Okay.
You have to retrain it. And how do you treat anxiety? You know that for sure. Exposure,
Absolutely.
retraining.
Yeah.
And so when kids that have that type of concussion, the vestibular problem, get told that they shouldn't do anything and rest in a dark room and not exercise, by definition, that is the worst possible thing you could do for that type of concussion.
Right. And yet that's what we used to tell people to do, right?
That's what a lot of people are still told to do. It depends on what type of concussion you have as to what sort of approach you'll take from an injury. And that's why, again, seeing a specialist is so important. My rule of thumb is that the best way to prevent problems with concussion is to manage it effectively when you have one. One thing we know that works in terms of getting people better faster is that patients that have symptoms in the field, get them off the field. We just did a study published in pediatrics where we looked at a very large group of athletes, half of whom had symptoms of concussion and came out of play immediately, and the other half had symptoms of concussion and continued to play for 15 minutes on average. The patients that continued to play for 15 minutes on average took twice as long to recover than those that came off the field quickly. Wow. It was something like 19 versus 46 days. So wow. more than twice as long. Playing for 15 extra minutes added another 30 something days onto the recovery, or whatever it is, 29 days or whatever it is. Crazy, right? So we know that playing through this injury is harmful for your outcomes. And so when you have signs and symptoms of injury, if you come out of play, we can get patients better a lot faster. And so I think that that's the best information to give parents right now, is be aware of the signs and symptoms of injury. Look, these are sports. Every sport carries a risk of this. The good news is it's treatable, but you need to be treated for it to be treatable. And it's also an injury. There's a lot of misinformation out there about cumulative effects of injury. If you manage a concussion effectively, we don't see an increased risk of either having another one or more severe outcomes. And we've published some papers on that. If it's managed properly, you can mitigate a lot of poor outcomes. Now, look, common sense and our research would tell you, if you have a kid that's had 3 concussions in a year, there's something going on. And take them to a clinician, because most of the time when I see patients like that, they have an ocular problem that hasn't been treated. They have a vestibular problem that hasn't been treated. They have a migraine problem that hasn't been treated. They have anxiety that hasn't been treated. And once you treat those problems, guess what? They don't get concussed as easily. There's very few. We see about 20,000 cases a year in our clinic here. I don't know if I can count on more than one hand patients that leave this clinic that aren't normal when they leave here. And we're talking patients that are sometimes years out from injury. We still can treat the great majority of problems that we see with this injury. Parents don't have to feel guilty about letting their kids play sports. Just make sure it's managed effectively when there's an injury.